I'm Mr. Loomis. Welcome back for our second lesson about World War II. Today, we're finally going to make all of our military history fans happy by talking about generals, battles, victories, and defeats. Let's get started with a preview of our topics. We're going to start today by taking a look at the two sides, the Axis and Allies. We'll describe the major battles in the Allies' fight against Hitler's Germany and how the war in Europe ended. Then we're going to turn to the Pacific and talk about the war against Japan, including the major battles there. We'll finish by talking about the Manhattan Project and the use of the atomic bomb to end the war against Japan. Let's get started with a look at the world in 1941, when the United States joined the war. In June 1941, Hitler broke the agreement he made with Stalin and attacked the Soviet Union. The Germans killed both Red Army soldiers and civilians by the millions. Hitler's surprise attack brought the Soviet Union into the war on the side of the Allies, an unlikely friend, but one that was important. With Germany fighting the Soviets in the East and the British and the Americans in the West, its armies would always be divided. America, too, was fighting on two fronts and had to make hard choices about how to divide its military power. Roosevelt thought if Hitler and the Nazis were able to take all of Europe, they would be much harder to fight than if Japan took over all of the Pacific. American scientists worried that with enough time, German scientists might make a nuclear weapon. So American leaders decided that defeating Hitler was the first priority. American leaders wanted to be more aggressive about attacking the Germans than the British. Landing on the beach of France would be a way to directly attack Germany. But British leaders were not sure if it would work. Winston Churchill was afraid that invading France would cost too many men and supplies and would hurt the Allies' chances of winning. So Roosevelt and Churchill agreed to start a blockade to stop supplies from getting to Germany and to begin bombing of German cities and factories. The army would attack Hitler's army at their weakest points first and slowly move towards Germany. This plan was known as closing the ring, and the first step was to fight the German army in North Africa. The attack started in October 1942. Led by British General Bernard Montgomery, the British army attacked German and Italian soldiers led by the Desert Fox, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, at El Alamein in Egypt. As the British forced a German retreat, more British American soldiers landed on the west coast of Africa. Rommel was smart, but he had fewer soldiers and had to give up in the end. The Allies won their first important victory against Germany in North Africa. At the same time, the Soviets started winning against the German army at Stalingrad. When spring came in 1943, the Allies had started to close the ring. After beating the Germans in North Africa, the Allies took the next step towards Germany by attacking Italy. American and British leaders believed that the Italian people did not want to fight, and that when the Allies attacked, the Italian people would rise up and get rid of Mussolini. German leaders were afraid that this would give the Allies a free road through Italy to Germany. So German soldiers moved in to defend Italy. Even with the German army in Italy, Mussolini was arrested and Italy surrendered. Even without the help of the Italians, German soldiers defended Italy. And some of the worst fighting of the war happened in Italy. The time had finally come for a full attack against Germans in Europe. British and American troops had taken back North Africa and pushed into Italy. Soviet troops had turned back the Germans at Stalingrad and were slowly taking back their land. By 1944, American and British planes from airports in England had started around-the-clock bombing attacks at the factories, railroad lines, ports, and other important places in Germany. Allied leaders wanted to stop Germany from being able to fight war. Firebombing of cities was meant to burn entire neighborhoods. Similar attacks took place on Japanese cities. Before the war ended, 40% of all the homes in major Japanese cities had been burned on purpose by Allied attacks, and hundreds of thousands of people died. Since the start of the war, Hitler's armies had controlled all of France, the Low Countries of Belgium and the Netherlands, and most of Eastern Europe. His Atlantic wall of defenses along the beaches of France made an invasion of his territory dangerous. Stalin's Soviet army had been the only Allied leader, Stalin in the Soviet Union had been the only Allied leader fighting Hitler in Europe. Stalin wanted Great Britain and the United States to attack the Germans in France to give his soldiers in the East a break. Finally, in 1944, the Americans and British were ready. It was going to be the largest invasion force in history. The Allies spent a lot of time trying to confuse the Germans by making fake messages about their plans. The trick worked, and German leaders thought that the attack would come at Calais. The truth was that General Dwight Eisenhower planned Operation Overlord for Normandy, a different beach in France. Just after midnight on June 6, 1944, Allied soldiers parachuted behind enemy lines to cut communications. As the German guards looked out at the English Channel in the morning, they saw the largest group of ships ever in history headed towards the French beaches. There were 5 points of attack. Gold and Sword beaches were taken by the British. Juno Beach was attacked by Canadian soldiers. The Americans had to capture Utah and Omaha beaches. Many men died on the first day of the attack. Still, by the end of the day, German troops retreated and the Allies had taken control of the beaches. A successful landing in France on June 6th, or D-Day, along with the Battle of Stalingrad in the east, are the turning point battles in the war against Hitler's Germany. After D-Day, the German army was defeated little by little. Paris was liberated in August of 1944, as the Allies pushed slowly towards the east. At the same time, the Soviet Union was moving into Germany from the east. Trying to put off what was going to be a final defeat, Hitler made one final attack in December 1944. The attack caught the Allies by surprise, and the Battle of the Bulge, so named because of the shape of the battle lines on the map, slowed the Allied armies, but it did not stop them. By the spring of 1945, most of the German armies had been defeated, and the Americans, British, and Free French were racing the Soviets to Berlin. Along the way, they found Hitler's concentration camps and saw the horrible things that Nazis had done. American soldiers saw humans that looked more like skeletons, gas chambers, crematoriums, and thousands of victims. American leaders knew that Hitler was killing some Jewish people, but they were surprised to find out about the Holocaust of 12 million Jews. The Soviets got to Berlin first and found that Adolf Hitler had killed himself the day before. The last German soldiers gave up on May 8, 1945, a day now called VE Day, short for Victory in Europe. Let's turn now to the war in the Pacific against Japan. Pearl Harbor was only the beginning of Japanese attack on the United States. 2 days after attacking Pearl Harbor, they took the island of Guam, and 2 weeks after that, they took Wake Island. Before 1941 ended, the Philippines came under attack. Led by General Douglas MacArthur, the Americans hoped that they could hold the Philippines. MacArthur and the Americans tried to hold off the Japanese at an old fort called Corregidor, but in the end, the Japanese were stronger, and they had no choice but to surrender the Philippines. Before being called away by President Roosevelt, General MacArthur promised, "I shall return." After MacArthur escaped, the Japanese forced Filipino and American soldiers on a walk to a prison at Bataan. The 85-mile trip, remembered as the Bataan Death March, is an example of how cruel the Japanese military was to prisoners. 16,000 people died along the way, and many more died in prison. In June 1942, Japan wanted to take Midway Island, an American base about 1,000 miles from Hawaii. The Japanese plan, like the earlier attack on Pearl Harbor, was to stop the Americans from fighting in the Pacific, so that Japan would be free to do what it wanted in Asia. The Japanese thought another defeat would get the United States to give up. This time, the plan did not work, because the Americans were more powerful than the Japanese thought, and because American cryptographers had broken the Japanese Navy's secret codes and knew what the Japanese were planning. 4 Japanese and 3 American aircraft carriers joined the battle. All 4 of Japan's large carriers, part of the 6th carrier force that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, and a heavy cruiser were sunk, while the Americans lost only one carrier and a destroyer. After Midway, Japan could not replace its lost men, ships, and planes fast enough to fight off the Americans. For this reason, Midway is the turning point in the Pacific War. After the Battle of Midway, the Americans slowly moved west across the Pacific, attacking Japanese-held islands on their way to Japan. Instead of attacking the Japanese on every island of Micronesia and Melanesia, the United States chose a path that would move American forces closer and closer to the Japanese mainland by attacking the islands where the Japanese were the weakest and skipping those that would be harder to attack. This left them cut off from communication and supplies. Using this island hopping plan, General MacArthur led the advance toward Japan. In October 1944, MacArthur kept his promise and returned to the Philippines. In the first half of 1945, Americans took the island of Iwo Jima, which was used for an airport for bombers to attack Japan. The final island held by Japan was the large island of Okinawa. The battle on Okinawa has been called the Reign of Steel in Japan because of how terrible the fighting was, and because of the Japanese kamikaze suicide airplane attacks. About 160,000 soldiers died on both sides. And about 150,000 Okinawan people died also, which was half of all the people on the island. During the battle, Americans found out that President Roosevelt had died. For many young soldiers, Roosevelt was the only president they could remember. He'd been elected 4 times and served a total of 12 years in office. Vice President Harry Truman took his place, and it fell to the new president to decide how to end the war in the Pacific. After seeing how bad the Battle of Okinawa had been, Truman wanted to find a way to end the war without having to attack the 4 main islands of Japan. Truman's answer came from the world of science. Early in 1939, the world scientists discovered that German physicists had learned the secrets of splitting a uranium atom. Fear spread that the Nazi scientists might use that energy to make an atomic bomb. Scientists Albert Einstein and Enrico Fermi agreed that the president must be told about the dangers of atomic technology in the hands of the Axis powers. Fermi traveled to Washington, but few government leaders listened. Einstein wrote a letter to President Roosevelt to tell him that America needed to build an atomic bomb before the Germans. Roosevelt thought it was too expensive and wouldn't be needed, but agreed to start working on it anyway, which was called the Manhattan Project. In 1942, Fermi led a group of physicists to produce the first controlled nuclear chain reaction at the University of Chicago. After the success, the government spent more money on the project. Nuclear facilities were built at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington. The main factory was built at Los Alamos, New Mexico. Robert Oppenheimer was put in charge of putting the pieces together at Los Alamos. In all, $2 billion was spent on making the atomic bomb, and the Manhattan Project gave jobs to over 120,000 Americans. Keeping the project a secret was very important. Roosevelt and Churchill agreed that Stalin should not know about it, and no one in America ever knew about it, so there was never a debate about if building an atomic bomb was a good idea or not. Keeping 120,000 people quiet would never have been possible. So, only a small number of scientists and leaders knew about the final goal. In fact, Vice President Truman had never heard of the Manhattan Project until he became president. By the summer of 1945, Oppenheimer was ready to test the first atomic bomb. On July 16, 1945, at Trinity Site in New Mexico, scientists of the Manhattan Project got ready to watch the world's first atomic bomb. A bright flash lit up the morning sky. A mushroom cloud reached 40,000 feet. When the cloud returned to Earth, it created a half-mile wide crater that turned sand to glass. The explosion blew out windows and homes 100 miles away. Soon word reached President Truman that the bomb had worked. The world had entered the nuclear age. When Harry Truman learned about the Manhattan Project, he knew he had an important decision to make. He could use the atomic bomb to end the war, but it would mean using the most terrible weapon ever invented. Americans were tired from 4 years of war, and it did not seem like Japan was going to give up. Americans had taken Okinawa and Iwo Jima and were firebombing American cities or Japanese cities, but Japan still had an army of 2 million men getting ready to fight back against an invasion. Before using the bomb, the Allies asked the Japanese leaders to give up and warned that if they did not, there would be total destruction, but did not tell them about the new atomic bomb. The Japanese military leaders refused to surrender. On August 6, 1945, a plane called the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. 70,000 Japanese people died. In the months and years that followed, 100,000 more people died from burns and radiation sickness. The Japanese leaders still refused to surrender. And on August 9th, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, where 80,000 Japanese people died. On August 14, 1945, the Japanese finally gave up. VJ Day, or Victory in Japan Day, is remembered on either August 14th or 15th, depending on which day it was in the world when people heard the news. Or sometimes on September 2nd, the day the Japanese leaders signed the agreement to surrender on the USS Missouri battleship in Tokyo Bay. The choice to use the atomic bomb and to use it on a city in which thousands of civilians would die has been debated. Some military historians think that Japan was about to give up and America did not need to use the atomic bomb. Others have said that the choice to use the bomb in Japan and not Germany shows American racism. These people question whether Truman would have been willing to use the bomb against Europeans. Some said that Truman made a terrible choice that had hurt the United States for many years. Looking into the future, Truman should have seen that using the atomic bomb would lead to other countries wanting atomic bombs of their own. Some think that the atomic bomb was used to end the war quickly before the Soviets would have a chance to attack Japan from the north. In this view, Truman wanted the United States to be the only country to control Japan, unlike the way Germany had been split up between the Allies. Other people think that Truman wanted to show the Soviet Union how strong America was. In this way, Hiroshima and Nagasaki may have been the first shots of the Cold War against the Soviets, as well as the final shots of World War II. No matter what the actual reason, the United States is still the only nation in the world to ever use a nuclear bomb in war. Truman himself said that his choice to drop the bomb was just about winning. An attack like D-Day in Japan would have led to millions of deaths. Truman thought that the bomb saved Japanese lives as well as American. He did not want the war to go on any longer. Some of his critics asked why Truman did not show the bomb's power by dropping it in the countryside. But the president did not like this idea. He knew that the Japanese might not surrender if the test succeeded, and he thought that if it failed, it would be even worse. Even most scientists had not thought about the awful effects of radiation sickness. Truman saw little difference between atomic bombing Hiroshima and firebombing Dresden or Tokyo. For Truman, war was terrible. Winning was the goal, and he saw no reason why he should not use every weapon he had. The ethical debate over the choice to drop the atomic bomb will probably never end. The bombs did, however, bring an end to the worst war in history. The Manhattan Project that produced it showed how the country could use its enormous resources in a crisis. However, the use of atomic weapons did start a dangerous arms race as the strongest countries in the world tried to build their own nuclear bombs. This Cold War with the Soviet Union lasted for the next 50 years. In fact, that story is going to be the subject of our next unit, but we're not quite there yet. Let's recap today's big ideas. Hitler broke his deal with Stalin and invaded the Soviet Union. This resulted in an alliance, the Soviet Union, United States, United Kingdom or Great Britain, and China, fighting against the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. The Allies concentrated their efforts first in northern Africa, and after winning there, invaded Italy. The turning points of the war in Europe came on D-Day and at the Battle of Stalingrad. Intensive bombing campaigns over Germany slowly weakened the enemy as Allied forces pushed inward from both east and west. Eventually, Germany collapsed, Hitler committed suicide, and the war in Europe ended. In the Pacific, the Americans were forced to surrender the Philippines to the invading Japanese. The turning point came at the Battle of Midway, when the United States was able to sink critical aircraft carriers from the Japanese fleet. Without the resources to rebuild or resupply, the war in the Pacific was a long, slow struggle to recapture tiny islands held by Japan. During the war, America's top-secret Manhattan Project developed the first atomic bomb. President Truman took office when Roosevelt died in 1944 and decided to use the atomic bomb to force Japan to surrender. There's still debate about the morality of using atomic weapons on cities with large civilian populations. Japan's surrender in 1945 brought an end to the war. Thank you for sticking with me all the way to the end. In our final lesson about World War II, we're going to be learning about how the war changed life in America. I'll see you then.
Seems you're right.